The black community, a part of, yet separate from the wider community, as varied as Afro-Americans are varied, yet inevitably fused by common heritage, common problems, common foes. Born of discrimination, yet determined to exercise self-determination. The black community, city within a city, a people within a people, a nation within a nation.
My dictation is a splendid rhyme that prove race discrimination never ending. Yo, peep the situation. My dictation is a splendid rhyme that prove race discrimination never ending. Repeat the situation. My dictation is a splendid rhyme that prove race discrimination never ending. Yo, peep the situation. My dictation is a splendid rhyme that prove race discrimination never ending.
Much attention has come to be focused upon the black community. To many whites, it has always been that other part of town, which was generally to be avoided, ignored, even feared. To some other whites, it has been a bonanza for economic exploitation through high slum rentals, overpriced merchandise and services, organized crime, and even well-paying jobs as police, firemen, school and social service administrators. To most blacks, the black community is an amalgam of often conflicting realities. On one hand, it may be a warm, familiar, friendly place called home, and a haven away from prejudice. Despite common myths to the contrary, there are many Afro-Americans who take great pride in their neighborhoods and make every effort to maintain and improve them. On another hand, a black community may be a seriously deprived and deteriorating ghetto, slum, or concentration camp, neglected or abandoned by responsible authorities. Whatever the individual case, and there are many types of neighborhoods in which black Americans live, including integrated ones, the black community is the subject of growing attention these days. Most Afro-Americans live in all-black neighborhoods. They do so largely because they are forced to, by lack of economic opportunity, by a tight and racially restricted housing market, and by the tendency of white people to flee once black people move nearby. In addition, laws, written and unwritten, have been used to deny open housing opportunities to black people, despite court rulings against restrictive covenants, and despite exposure of widespread bias practices by real estate establishments and mortgage lending institutions. When housing is open to blacks, it very often occurs in neighborhoods adjacent to already established black communities, rather than in providing free choice of the general housing market. Thus again, contrary to popular belief, the mass migrating generally reputed to have spawned the so-called black ghetto, in many instances, only expanded black enclaves already firmly established. Though there had been previous exoduses of Afro-Americans from south to north, from slavery days through the aftermath of Reconstruction, it was not until World War I that the great migrations of black people began. They left the South in droves, seeking jobs, higher wages, better schools, better housing, the right to vote, and a somewhat less dehumanizing system of discrimination and segregation. Once arrived, however, the black migrant found himself forced into congested black colonies with inflated rents. Segregated housing patterns quickly developed, as well as a deterioration of these areas. Lack of upkeep and improvement by often absentee landlords, and the steady decline of city services such as police protection, garbage removal, and street paving became commonplace. Thus began and continues the pattern of the black ghetto. Incidentally, the word ghetto historically meant an area where Jews were confined by prejudiced Christians in predominantly non-Jewish European cities. The story of the obliteration by the Nazis of the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland during World War II is well known. In America today, however, the word ghetto has come to be associated most exclusively with areas occupied by non-whites, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and especially blacks. The word ghetto is not, however, all-inclusive of the concept of the black community. Here to discuss the matter with Malkia Roberts is Mr. Sterling Tucker, Executive Director of the Washington D.C. Urban League.
Mr. Tucker, in recent years, the term ghetto has almost become synonymous with the word slum. In your mind, would these two be necessarily the same?
No. In a technical sense, they wouldn't be, but in a real sense, I guess they are. A ghetto at one time was, we thought in terms of a particular kind of people living together, not a physical state or not a state of mind, but thought of it geographically. Here now we think in terms of a ghetto as being synonymous with deprivation, being synonymous with color, or being synonymous with what are regarded in our society as negative factors. And so a ghetto is not a place where one might want to live. During the civil rights movement, people tried to broaden the base of it, to talk about the suburban ghetto where people were all economically the same, etc., but it never caught on.
What about the term black community? Does it mean necessarily a contiguous physical area, or does it refer to a communality of thought and feeling among black people?
Yes, I think it represents color assuming a commonality of black thought, rather than a geographical area. However, much of America, even with our fair housing laws, even with desegregation, we still find such a thing as a black community physically, while it does not include, of course, all members of the black community generally because it's on a broader basis. There is a large enough body which can establish an image of the black people in a city, in an area. But we tend on, however, to think in terms of black community as all black people. There is that reference, and it is rather inclusive, resented often by many blacks, I might add.
What factors and devices keep blacks ghettoized?
Well, I think mainly it's custom and tradition, and custom and tradition are acceptable generally by people, whatever they are, and that's what people don't understand. For instance, the way housing gets financed. If there isn't mortgage money available for blacks outside of certain areas, they can't get in. And so the whole financing structure keeps them ghettoized. The whole real estate industry, the way it functions, if there are neighborhoods where it's the unwritten code that blacks don't go into these neighborhoods, why they don't get in. That keeps them ghettoized. So you can see the control of the movement and the pattern of blacks. And except that they are able to finance themselves, it's hard to break out. And so what happens is, as they are ghettoized, you can, bad services tend to follow. We find the poorest schools in those neighborhoods. We find the highest crime. We find the poor street cleaning. We find the poor garbage collection. And so all these things tend to ghettoize. But the structure of financing, the structure and the pattern of movement controls this, and then you tend to neglect it. And therefore, that's why it's easier to discriminate against blacks when you have them in ghettos, because then you can discriminate against a whole group and build a whole network of bad services for them. And you keep them also unpoliticized that way too. If you can become politicized, highly politicized, and they can break out of these traditions. So that's why we got to break out of the ghetto, because we then move into other parts of the community where people are concerned with the same kind of problems as we are, and color is no longer a factor. Good education is good education. You move into a community where people are organized and where they can have influences and where they exercise these influences and have political power and exercise it, it will redound to the benefit of blacks. But we've institutionalized ghettoization, and because it has been a factor in our society for so long, we accept it as a way of life, except for those who are able to break through. and enough break through and seem to move out that to some the pattern seems not to be there.
Ghetto residents often blame landlords, that is, both black and white landlords, for allowing their properties to deteriorate. And then on the other hand, the landlords blame the tenants. Now, where in between here do you feel that the truth actually lies?
Well, that's one of those chicken and egg kind of problems, really. Where we find good management on the part of landlords, where we find that they do the things that normally are the landlord responsibilities, we find a higher positive response on the part of tenants. Conversely, where we find tenants who seem to want and take care of what is available to them, we find generally a good response on the part of landlords. So I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do in a lot of places around the country is to develop landlord-tenant commissions which would recognize the responsibility on both sides.
Despite the many oppressive features of the ghetto, there may also be found evidences of distinctive cultural patterns and lifestyles among its residents. No one lifestyle characterizes the black community any more than the white community. Some persons live a so-called middle-class lifestyle, valuing respectability, education, chastity, religion, home ownership, and financial independence. Others follow styles which embrace relaxation of morals, involvement with the underworld, and ostentatious behavior. Still others may be said to form an upper class, engage in business and professions, support social and charitable institutions, both all black and interracial, and enjoy fruitful lives that would be the envy of many so-called well-to-do whites. Still, in adapting to the urban setting, certain common culture patterns have survived among many blacks, which have enabled them to construct a unique community of their own within the larger society. This creative adaptability has aided black people on all levels to survive in an atmosphere that might have been even more destructive than it has. Sociologist St. Clair Drake, who with Horace Caton wrote a monumental study of Chicago's South Side black community entitled Black Metropolis, states that when the average black person walks the street of his community, he sees, smells, and senses the sights and sounds characteristic of the ghetto. Writing in the fall 1965 issue of Daedalus, Dr. Drake observes, poetically, the smell of barbecued ribs, fried shrimp, and fried chicken emanating from numerous restaurants gives olfactory reinforcement to a feeling of at-homeness. The beat of gut music spilling into the street from ubiquitous tavern jukeboxes, and the sound of tambourines and rich harmony from behind crude folk art on the windows of storefront churches gives auditory confirmation to the universal belief that we black people have soul. The bedlam of an occasional brawl, the shouted obscenities of street corner foul mouths, and the whine of police sirens break the monotony of waiting for the number that never falls, the horses that neither win, place, nor show, and the good jobs that never materialize. The spontaneous vigor of the children who crowd streets and playgrounds, and the cheerful rushing about of adults, free from the occupational pressures of the white world in which they work, create an atmosphere of warmth and superficial intimacy which obscures the unpleasant facts of life in the overcrowded rooms behind the doors. This, then, says Dr. Drake, is the world of black urban folk culture or folkways. For the ghetto dweller, he continues, the arguments in the barbershop, the gossip in the beauty parlors, the jiving of bar girls and waitresses, the click of pool room balls, the stamping of feet in the dance halls, and the shouting in the churches are all theirs. Through this sense of unity and identification, Drake finds that black people are able to sift something constructive out of the sometimes demoralizing situation of the ghetto. They're able to form a positive self-image of that society and culture which is theirs, and to relate to an appropriate value system and pattern of behavior for members of their society. We further discussed this concept with our guest authority, Mr. Sterling Tucker, and asked whether he agreed that such matters as hairstyle, for example, are a factor in creating a positive self-image.
Yes, I think that was a way of saying that to white America, what you've considered bad, that is Africa, what you've considered backward, we identify with. was partly his way of saying that, look, I used to reject Africa too. I used to reject my blackism or my Negroism or my Africanism, and now I accept it, and I'm boldly portraying it. The dashiki and all of these things were symbols of it. The African jewelry, all kinds of ways to begin to identify with Africa. The springing up of different kinds of friends of Nigeria, friends of Tanzania, friends of Liberia, all these organizations began to spring up. But young people began to find this identification. In other words, this business of no longer accepting a role of imitating white America while being black and being on the fringes of white America, but saying, look, we are black, we want the benefits of it, we're going to live as blacks until such time as you erase or eliminate the barriers. Once the barriers are truly eliminated, then we will move into a real society, which is not a white society, but a people's society, made up of all the peoples, of our community or of the nation. So there was and what supported all this, I think, was a growing black young middle class. It used to be that young blacks were moving away from the black community. The more education they got, the more upward mobility they achieved, the more acculturation they had, the more they moved away. But blacks were getting themselves trained to be a part of the black community, to influence it, but to influence American thought and patterns and habits. And all this, I think, is a part of that whole period, which has served as to provide, even with some of its exaggerations, has provided a good, solid, substantial base now for America to move forward, I believe.
Can you think of other ways in which black culture has had an influence on the wider American community?
Well, I think that the contributions in the field of music and art and the dance, both the African and what I consider the original Black American, the contributions made by Black America here, artists such as Aretha Franklin and Stevie Wonder, and we go down a whole list of them. But people like Duke Ellington for years brought their own inimitable style to American music, which reflected much of the pain and agony, but also the rhythm and hope of Black America. But you take it on from there to what was considered at one time a characteristic relating primarily to blacks: the watermelon and the chitterlings and the spare ribs and the collard greens, this kind of good cooking and eating. Now, sometimes we have to beat others away from the counter so we can get there to it. I think that perhaps some of the spirit of Black America, too, is now beginning to permeate the lives of young whites. I mean, there's a depth of spirit which is beyond just existence that I think is a characteristic always, I felt, of Black America. A high degree of sensitivity that I felt was not always present in white America, that I see more in the young whites, children in white younger ages in the past, but as they moved more into college and adulthood, seemed to have lost some of this, moving more into the traditional patterns of American life. I find that more people now are able to move through the middle age groups and into the college years and beyond, and still maintain what I think is a kind of sensitivity which blacks have contributed to America in a very special kind of way.
Within recent years, Black Americans on all levels have come to see more clearly the nature of the forces which historically have shaped and controlled the black community. Whether a deprived ghetto dweller living in a rundown tenement or an affluent professional encased in an expensive private home in the suburbs, there is now greater black consciousness than ever before of the need to take charge of the destiny of their own communities. The segregated black community is likely to be a fact of life in America for years to come, according to St. Clair Drake. As such, the accent among many blacks has shifted noticeably from the traditional goal of integration with a wider white society to a demand instead for community control of their own destiny in their own area. Though others reject this approach as approximating self-segregation, there is nonetheless wide agreement with the self-determination goals involved. Traditionally, white or largely all-white city councils, boards of education, police and fire departments, and various charitable and welfare agencies have called the shots for the residents of black communities. The sense of powerlessness has been widespread, as the white establishment virtually dictated to hapless blacks terms which literally determined whether they ate or went hungry, lived or died. Shorn now of the myths that white makes right and Mr. Charlie knows best, black people are calling for an end to such colonial control. If there is tax money allotted to the area for schools, hospitals, and social services, then they want to determine how it will be spent, who will get the contracts, and who will administer the programs. They want accountability if things go wrong, and the power to take steps to correct errors and neglect. In many southern towns and cities, for example, where streets in black neighborhoods traditionally went unpaved, while tax sums were spent on fine, landscaped boulevards in white areas, black people are demanding reparations and parity. And despite some differences of opinion among themselves over the relative merits of school busing for greater integration, black people are extremely cynical over white cries to stop busing, when, for most of this century, whites kept strangely silent, while busing was widely used to maintain segregation. Power to the people is a slogan which used to be identified with radically militant Black Panthers. The Panthers have languished in recent years, but the concept has not. Self-determination, political and economic control of their own communities is increasingly the gold myriad grassroots organization in the black community today. Malkia?
Gains are being made by insistence upon community control by residents of black communities.
I don't think very much. The reason it has not had very much is because no one really knows what community control is. And people reject community control, really whether by blacks or by whites. I think what people have really been talking about community involvement with a voice in decisions, and it has been projected in the wrong way. Different areas like New York City has experimented with community control of schools. It's been a disaster. Been some limited experimentation here in Washington in that regard. It's been a disaster. But you can have a decentralization of a school system where the people in the neighborhoods can have some responsibility and functioning in determining some of the policies and decisions of those schools, but there has to be some management which ties into a central system in some way, and there has to be some central kind of direction.
What kinds of devices and factors are being used to circumvent these demands?
Well, I think that mainly they've given in without giving community control. I think there's been more decentralization of community services and public services particularly. And I think this decentralization has served to achieve to some degree greater control. It has provided an opportunity for greater involvement, greater participation. There are more decisions that are being made now. Many schools, for instance, are permitting, in education, for example, parents to have something to say about selection of teachers, course selection, some of these kinds of things. In many community services and health services and daycare services are being decentralized, and blacks are having a greater involvement, greater participation in the programs, and much more is being built into these programs. But they've decentralized administration, they've decentralized service, decentralized authority, and some responsibility, and that's been a balance that I think is rather healthy and moving in the right direction.
What has been the reaction of the so-called white power structure to this insistence?
Well, I think that the reaction has been pretty much to reject them as a real concept, but to try to respond in a way to provide for a little more involvement. Frankly, I would be concerned if the white power structure simply said, okay, here you take it, because where that has generally happened, it has been failure. The Small Business Administration, in the days of the 60s when blacks were asking for more opportunity at business, and businesses were failing, even owned by whites by very heavy margin. They were pouring a lot of money into mom and pop stores in the black community, which were doomed to failure. They were just writing it off, not dealing with the real issue of black entrepreneurship, that is tying them to the mainstream. And here again, community control of schools have really been taking education out of the mainstream rather than putting them into the mainstream. And that's what we've wanted. So while rejecting it, they were doing, in my view, the black community a favor, but not really realizing that. But what has happened is, I think, because of that rejection to some degree, we have reached a higher degree of involvement on the part of blacks. As they've continued their demands, as they've become more involved, the white power structure has given more leeway in terms of that involvement.
With the increasing flight of the white middle class and white businesses to the suburbs and the resultant decay of the inner cities, what hope do you see for the future of the inner city?
Well, cities are in trouble in the main. My feeling, however, is that there's going to be a reversal of this trend, and we're going to see people coming back to the cities. In Washington, D.C., it's already beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen partly because of no growth policies in metropolitan areas. But it's going to happen also because we're going to have to go to a metropolitan form of government. I don't mean local governments giving up their autonomy, but there's going to be greater cooperation on a metropolitan basis, which means it won't be so easy to escape the problems of the city. And as Whitney Young, the late and great executive director of National Urban League, used to say, that we may have come over in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And as communities begin to discover that, and they're going to discover that, we are going to find that we're going to get a greater balance. But in the meantime, cities are in very serious trouble. Businesses are moving out. Even blacks are moving out as opportunities are growing. But I think cities again will be the place to live. The federal policies will have a great deal to do with this. Right now, there's nothing in the works that would appear that this is going to be saved right anytime soon. And so for the next several years, we're going to be in a life and death struggle for the future of the cities.
As more and more of our central cities become predominantly Afro-American, the realities of the black community, pro and con, are now seen as affecting all Americans. The rise of black mayors and other public administrators, the continuing battles over school desegregation and busing, the control and use of federal revenue-sharing funds, and the growing commuting difficulties of whites who have fled to the suburbs but still return to work in the city, all these are inevitably related to the widespread presence of black Americans in the inner city areas of the nation. For the problems of the cities, the suburbs, the schools, mass transit, the energy shortage, and a host of other issues which vitally affect us all will never be solved without all addressing the needs, desires, and aspirations of the people who dwell in the ghettos and other black communities of this country.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.